Hi everybody, I'm Kevin Angelis. It's great to be here at Type Weekend to get the chance to talk to everybody and share some things that I've been thinking about and working on for a while now. This is the first time that I'm ever doing something like this. I've never really spoken at a conference before, so I'm sorry if it's a bit awkward. Anyway, I'm a designer from Chennai, which is a city in the southern part of India. And today I'm going to talk about a project that I started a couple months ago, around the beginning of 2020, back in the before times when things were a lot more optimistic and the world didn't seem to be on fire all the time. The project was called Indian Ephemera, and I really hope this isn't going to get too preachy, so I'm just going to try and keep it concise and not just ramble off into space. So Indian Ephemera is a repository of design objects and design solutions from the Indian subcontinent. At present, you can find us on Instagram at Ephemera India, and there's a website, a zine, and a bunch of other cool stuff in the works. So please check us out. Uh, I've always been a little bit of a hoarder, which is something that my friends, my family, my roommates, pretty much anyone that I've ever lived with can attest to. And collecting random tiny little things, from coasters and bus tickets to posters that were, let's just say I borrowed them from places like street corners and tea shops. But collecting these things that I found interesting was something that always fascinated me. So this project is kind of a manifestation of that. This massive visual hoard of things that I can draw from and I can look at from a specific context when I want to. So, a little bit more about myself. I am a recent graduate of design college. I finished my final semester of design school from the DJ Academy of Design, which is a college in Coimbatore, another city in the south of India. And while we had a great curriculum, we did learn a lot about design history in class. We were taught predominantly about the Bauhaus and design movements that happened in places that were in India. It was this very white people centric way of design, almost as if nobody else, anywhere else, contributed anything to design. This, for a while, ended up influencing my entire outlook of design, since for the most part, that's what I saw as design, something that's ordered and minimalistic and created in a studio on a laptop running the Adobe suite. See, for about 4 years ago, I barely had a clue what design was. That this thing is a career and that people could make a living out of it. And even though I had a ton of fun doing a lot of stuff that would technically be considered design, from drawing letters for a made up language that I did as a kid to putting together posters and branding for events in high school, this sanitary, studio bred kind of version of design seemed to be at odds with that. In my second year though, I was shown a TED talk by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, who is a brilliant writer who grew up in a university campus in Nigeria, who talked about the dangers of having, a single story, like one particular narrative, which kind of prompted a later discussion with a group of my friends in the hostel that we stayed in, who all lived in the same corner. And we talked about representation in design, which kind of led me to think, to me, I believe that design is essentially just a tool of communication that solves problems. And in some cases, I began to feel that by designing in a specific way, I wasn't necessarily approaching the problem in the right way. And that doing things the way they had been done so far isn't and wasn't the only way that they should or could be done. So Indian Ephemera was born out of this looking for roots, trying to define what Indian design is as something that is pluralistic, as an amalgamation of all of its influences. We draw these lines between design and craft, between design and what we call vernacular design, and we tend to create our own little designer bubble that tends to influence itself. Like I've seen Indian designers from design schools get influenced by and inspired by other Indian designers from design schools. So that ends up being like a little self-fulfilling circle that just goes around. So Indian design can root itself in our own needs, in our own materials and our own traditions to solve our problems. And by looking at the way that we've solved these problems since forever, we can find better ways to solve new problems. So there's this strange dichotomy between the ideas of what is good and what is bad design. But I personally feel that bad design is just good design in the wrong context. If we look at design as a whole, as a problem solving paradigm, then by nature, if it solves a problem, it is good. And we as designers, and maybe this is just an Indian thing, we often end up designing devoid of the context of everyday and local use, which is to say that the vast majority of design and design solutions that we interact with on a regular basis, or for that matter, commissioned by design clients, are not really within the magic circle or the Lakshman Rekha of what we call good design by good designers, or even for that matter, immortalized in the canon of design education that we learn from, even if it is from an Indian school. At best, we tend to selectively pick and choose, maybe even appropriate aspects of one of the many visual vocabularies in the subcontinent that are seen as quirky or kitschy. And we choose to allow these to represent the country as a whole, like truck typography, which I've been guilty of myself. And while this is in no way a bad thing, it doesn't and it shouldn't be the only aspect we draw roots from. At its worst, what ends up happening is that we tend to distance ourselves from bad design by not designers. Those people like DTP operators or Xerox shop owners or that one random kid from high school who Googled how to get free Photoshop. And, we outright ignore its place in our lives as design solutions. So the concept of design, the way that it's viewed by trained practitioners throughout the subcontinent, seems to be a more blander, secular approach, which isn't really shared by a large section of society whose cultural contextual approach gains its understanding from their own popular culture. From your neighborhood auntie who thinks that I am a fashion designer, since fashion is definitely seen as a more popular career option in the country than, say, something like type design, which I actually doubt most people know exists, to your local tech bro and Steve Jobs fanboy who thinks that the pinnacle of design is the Apple logo and thinks that all design should be in the same vein. And while the Apple logo is a great logo, the context that it was designed in is vastly different from the context that it's used in. I've even, for that matter, seen saris printed with the Apple logo as well as the Facebook or WhatsApp logos. And that's something that the original designer might have never accounted for, or for that matter, even imagined would ever happen. So it is these differences and this diversity in context which allows even universally ostracized design elements, like Mistral or Impact or Comic Sans, which we consider the trifecta of questionable meme fonts, take on new layers of meaning. Mistral, for example, in Chennai, is seen as a very relatable, friendly font, which is used on bike bumper stickers. Used to write these questionable poetry on the back of vehicles, since according to a local sticker cutter, it's apparently very similar to hand painted type, which a lot of people know and interact with and already have present in their visual vocabularies. So isn't that sticker cutter also a graphic designer? He does create the solution to a given need. He combines information and a visual to communicate something. It's just that he lacks the vocabulary to call himself a designer. Our own history in the context of design is fairly limited. But what if we drew context from different roots? I remember reading about the Indus Valley seals in some point in school. And it just struck me, isn't that graphic design? Isn't that branding? These symbols of like these fantastic beasts like unicorns and giant bulls were used to represent one particular merchant, which was essentially the earliest form of a logo. So probably the oldest use of graphic design in a contemporary sense for a brand is the Indus Valley seals. So why aren't more people talking about this? Why aren't designers talking about this? And why aren't design students learning about this? So what about all these other examples? So let's take, for example, a few more. What about these bricks that convey information about the manufacturer? So the initials are embossed into the brick itself, and in a very specific form follows function kind of um, way to identify the makers of a substandard brick. That might be adulterated clay, or that might be large chunks of gravel in the bricks, and that could cause property damage. And once the property is damaged, it's just a very easy way to find out who's responsible, since you can just see the name on it. Or these hand painted posters, which are painted by Ramachandraya, who is a sign painter from Hyderabad, and he designed these to be photocopied on these massive sheets of copy paper, and wheat pasted on street corners and under bridges. And these are made for some of the biggest movies in modern times. And but they serve as an alternative to traditionally printed posters, which some smaller single screen theaters can't really afford in India. Or what about these brutalist Xerox labels, which are used for disinfectants? They're packaged in a very iconic design element on its own, which is the Coke bottles. And they are just the furthest thing from minimalist. They go so far as to visually depict every single possible use of the disinfectant right there, right up front in front of you. So you've got like a car, you've got like a truck, and like a gas stove and floats and all these different things. So you see, I can only speak about the context that I know, the context that I experience and interact with on a regular basis. But the world is this massive place. It's a very diverse place, and we have so many cultures, not just based on geography, but also based on politics, based on religion, based on the entertainment that we consume, or even based on how we deal with problems. So, how many different possible solutions are there? How many different ways of approaching a problem can we see? Like personally, I'd love to see, like a Cuban ephemera, or a Mongolian ephemera, or a Rwandan ephemera, or, something as very specific as goth movie poster ephemera of the 19th century in Mexico. And you get the point, right? Like, we need to look at our past, and the context that we design in needs to be looked at as well, so that we can create new movements, new solutions and new visual vocabularies for our future, and new visual vocabularies that aren't limited by the binary of good and bad design. So that brings us to the end of this talk. But before I wind up, I'd just like to thank Type Weekend for giving me this opportunity. Anaga Narayan for pushing me to do this and helping out a lot, and my friends and family who have contributed to the multitude of discussions that have eventually led to this project. So thank you all, and thank you guys.